Mark Rogers TV with you on Sunday afternoon. I wanted to catch everyone before the next College Football Playoff Committee rankings come out on Tuesday night. This is going to be a mess. It currently is a mess. And yes, there is one regular season game left for everyone and conference championship weekend after that. But regardless of what happens, it's going to be a mess. So I was trying to work out the best case scenario for the playoff committee to make their jobs as easy as possible. That would most likely be Alabama wins out, wins the SEC championship. Florida State goes undefeated. They win out, win the ACC championship. Oregon wins out in the Pac-12 and wins the championship with one loss. And then either TCU or Baylor loses. Most likely TCU to Texas or Baylor losing to Kansas State in a couple weeks. Ohio State losing the Big Ten championship game to Wisconsin. That would leave Alabama SEC champion, Florida State SEC undefeated champion, Baylor or TCU the clear champion in the Big 12, and Oregon winning the Pac-12 championship and knocking UCLA down to 3 losses, and Ohio State losing to lose a second game. And Mississippi State, on top of that, would have to lose to Ole Miss, and that would pretty much take care of it, and that would bring you to a situation in which regardless of the bad scheduling and these teams not playing each other during the non-conference slate and really giving us a clear picture of evaluation, just in terms of conference champions, that would give us 4 of 5 conference champions making it. The Big Ten would be left out with 2 losses, but there would be no other 2-loss champions. And therefore, that would be the cleanest scenario I can come up with. Let's come up with the most messy scenario we can imagine. That would be Alabama wins out against Auburn next week, and then Mizzou, let's say they win next week against Arkansas, and then Missouri wins the SEC championship game. Okay, then we've got Missouri with 2 losses winning the SEC over Alabama, who now has 2 losses. Missouri having to jump from currently number 20, they'll probably be in the 15 or 16 range, all the way up into the top 4 if they were going to make it as an SEC champion. Alabama with 2 losses. Then you would have possibly Mississippi State with 2 losses if they would defeat or lose to Ole Miss, or Mississippi State with 1 loss. So what would you do if Alabama's the highest ranked team with going into the weekend, championship weekend, but they lose their second game, and it's the SEC championship game to Missouri. Missouri's got 2 losses. Georgia doesn't make it to the championship game, but they've got 2 losses, and they're coming in pretty hot, having again defeated a Georgia Tech team that went to the ACC championship. And then you've got Mississippi State, who's nowhere near the SEC championship game, but they only have 1 loss. Who goes from the SEC? Mizzou's the SEC champion. Alabama was the number 1 team. They both have 2 losses. Georgia has 2 losses, and they crushed Mizzou 34-0. Or you've got Mississippi State, the only team in the SEC with 1 loss, but they didn't even win the division. All right. How about the situation in the ACC? What if Florida State loses this week to Florida and they've got 1 loss, but then they win the ACC championship game and chaos ensues elsewhere? Florida State with 1 loss. Do they make it in? They're barely hanging on as a 3-loss team, barely winning games, or as a number 3 team in the country with 1 loss. Would they make it in, losing the ACC championship? And what do you do with Georgia Tech? If Georgia Tech has 2 losses and they beat Florida State head-to-head and they win the ACC championship game over Florida State, does Georgia Tech jump Florida State? All right, how about in the Big Ten if Wisconsin defeats Ohio State? Well, that would seem to be a pretty clear tiebreaker there. Wisconsin wins the Big Ten championship. They defeated Ohio State. They knocked down the Buckeyes to a 2nd loss. Wisconsin has 2 losses. Does Wisconsin get in? Well, that obviously depends on what else happens. Most likely no, but if chaos ensues elsewhere, sure. Well, if Alabama or Missouri wins the SEC with 2 losses, and then you've got, because of course Auburn could defeat Alabama, but Bama go on and play in the SEC championship game if Mississippi State loses to Ole Miss. And we're talking in circles here because we've got so many scenarios. We got Baylor and TCU. If they win out, is it going to come down to that head-to-head matchup? Baylor coming back to defeat TCU 61-58 way back mid-season. And what about UCLA? UCLA on a tear right now. They look pretty good. It would not shock me if they defeated Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. And that would leave you with UCLA with 2 losses, Oregon with 2 losses, and if Arizona State wins out, they've got 2 losses. Well, UCLA, having won the Pac-12 championship, having defeated Oregon in a rematch, and having defeated Arizona State head-to-head, I think that's pretty clear-cut. You have to give UCLA the number 1 nod out west out of the Pac-12 there. But the Big 12 is going to be messy unless one of 2 things happen. Baylor loses or TCU loses one of these 2 remaining games. Most likely TCU to Texas or Baylor to Kansas State. But Kansas State's got 2 losses. What if they defeat Baylor and jump back into the fray and we've got a 3-way tie or a 2-way tie for the Big 12 championship with TCU having defeated Kansas State and Kansas State beat Baylor and Baylor beat TCU. All sorts of scenarios out there, and it's not going to be pretty. There are going to be teams, I guarantee it. There are going to be multiple teams. I'm not talking about 1 or 2. I'm talking about multiple teams, beyond 2, that are going to have resumes, track records this season that are comparable and just as good as the teams that make the playoffs. It is impossible to select the 4 best teams in the country. There are times this season that people have thought that Auburn was one of the 4 best teams in the country, or Texas A&M. Yes, and other teams across the country. Notre Dame has been talked about as a top 4 team, and they're nowhere near that. They could lose a 5th game this weekend against USC. So, do we know, can we possibly know, with this scheduling structure, who the top 4 teams are in college football? The best 4 teams? No. The best the College Football Playoff Committee can do is select the 4 best resumes. And that's even going to be very debatable. And I tell you, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess. Is it better than the BCS? Yes, it's better than the BCS. It's not a better system in and of itself. The only reason it's better than the BCS is it affords 2 other teams with credentials the opportunity to work it out on the field and play it out and decide a champion. So it affords 2 other teams the opportunity. That's the only reason it's better than the BCS. You cannot have 13 people select the 4 best teams in college football when these teams don't even play each other. Can you believe that we had an entire college football season where we have, let's say, for example, the SEC with 14 teams playing 4 non-conference games? That's 56 games, and none of them played the conference that is supposed to be the 2nd best conference in college football, the Pac-12. No games between the Pac-12 and the SEC. That's criminal. That should not happen. Formula schedule, it's too much to talk about right now, but I have the plan for a formula schedule that would force these teams to play for each other and not have these schools running around the country scheduling their own games based on their own agenda. It would be a balanced formula schedule with non-conference games against Power 5 conference teams. All right, so I just went on a rant just to give you some case scenarios of what type of chaos is going to ensue. It could be small chaos involving 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 teams, or it could be ridiculous chaos involving 2 lost teams winning championships over 1 lost team sitting at home. We'll most likely have that in the SEC, especially with what we saw out of the Rebels this week against Arkansas. But, of course, we know that these teams and these results change from week to week, and Ole Miss could definitely turn it around and play the game of the year against Mississippi State at home next week. All right, let's talk about it. Would love to hear your thoughts on the College Football Playoff Committee's task at hand with one more regular season game plus the championship games coming up in 2 weeks, right here on Mark Rogers TV.